The wind whipping off Lake Michigan didn't just feel cold. It felt like a physical assault. It was the kind of sharp, biting Chicago chill that found the tiny gaps in your clothing and settled deep into your marrow. I stood there, wrapped in a heavy charcoal wool coat that had always been my favorite, but today, it felt about as thin as a sheet of paper. My boots were planted firmly in the frozen grass as I stared down at the gray granite headstone that marked the final resting place of my wife, Eleanor Thorne. Beloved wife and mother. That's what the stone said. It had been exactly 365 days since a stroke took her away from me. 365 days of a house that felt too big and far too quiet. Before she passed, our home always smelled like vanilla and the comforting, dusty scent of old account books. Now it just smelled like nothing. I felt the ache in my knees and hips, a reminder of 40 years spent hauling heavy lumber and pouring concrete foundations in weather exactly like this. I was 73 years old, and my body was a map of every building I had ever raised in this county. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill I felt standing right behind me. My two sons, Brandon and Justin, were shifting their weight from foot to foot, looking like they were waiting for a late bus rather than honoring the woman who had raised them. I could hear a faint, repetitive sound. Asterisk tap, tap, tap star. It was the sound of a finger hitting a smartphone screen. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was Brandon. At 45, he was a senior investment broker at a big-name firm, or at least that's the image he projected at the country club every Saturday. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my very first work truck, a shimmering charcoal fabric that looked out of place in a cemetery. "Sell it now," Brandon whispered, his voice hushed but intense. He had actually turned his back to his mother's grave to face the wind. I said, "Short the stock, for heaven's sake. Do not argue with me. Just dump the shares before the market closes." I clenched my jaw. We were at a memorial service, and my eldest son was more concerned with market fluctuations than the memory of his mother. Beside him was Justin, my younger boy, who was 40. He let out a loud, exaggerated sigh that seemed to echo across the quiet cemetery grounds. He checked his gold Rolex, a gift I had given him when he took over the restaurant I bought for him 5 years ago. A restaurant that, true to Justin's luck, had failed in less than 18 months. "Come on, Dad," Justin muttered, not even trying to lower his voice. "It's 20 degrees out here. Mom isn't going anywhere. We've paid our respects, so let's wrap this up." I tightened my grip on the handle of my cane. The truth was, I didn't really need the cane to walk, at least not all the time. I used it because it made people underestimate me. It made them think Harrison Thorne was just another harmless, fading retiree, not the man who had built half the commercial strip malls and warehouses in this part of Illinois. I turned around slowly, looking at their faces. Their eyes were empty of grief. They didn't look like sons. They looked like creditors waiting for an inheritance check to clear. Right then, my phone buzzed in my breast pocket. I ignored it, but it buzzed again, then a third time. It was persistent. I pulled it out and saw the name, Mike Kowalski. Mike was a solid man, a contractor I'd hired to renovate Eleanor's old office in our downtown building. Even after I sold my company, Thorne Construction, to the boys 5 years ago, I had kept that building. It was my history. I wanted to turn Eleanor's private office into a small library for underprivileged kids, a place she would have loved. I answered the phone with a sharp tone. "Mike, I am at the cemetery. This had better be an emergency." The voice on the other end was breathless. I could hear the heavy thud of dust settling and the clatter of a crowbar hitting concrete in the background. "Mr. Thorne," Mike stammered, his voice shaking. "Listen to me. I just took a sledgehammer to the east wall like the renovation plan said." "It was a false wall, sir." I frowned, the wind stinging my eyes. I built that office myself 30 years ago, Mike. There were no false walls. What are you talking about? I'm talking about a hidden room, Mr. Thorne, Mike said, his voice cracking with a nervousness I had never heard from him before. A completely hidden space. And you need to see this right now. I'm on my way, I said, turning toward my car. No, Mike shouted into the phone. Do not come alone, sir. Bring them. Bring Brandon and Justin. The blueprints. It's like she planned this. It's a direct order from your wife. My suspicion flared like a lit match. Why would my wife want them there, Mike? Because, Mike lowered his voice to a harsh, gravelly whisper. There is a note taped to a heavy steel safe in here. It's in Mrs. Thorne's handwriting. It says, "Do not open unless Harrison and both sons are present. Sir, you need to get down here before I call the authorities." This looks very heavy. The line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the phone cold against my ear. Eleanor had secrets. My Eleanor, who had balanced every invoice, every payroll check, and every receipt for our company for 4 decades. She had never hidden a single penny from me in all our years together. I looked back at my sons. They were already walking toward the parking lot, laughing about some video Justin had seen on social media. "Boys," I barked. This wasn't the voice of the tired old man they had grown used to ignoring. It was the foreman's voice, the voice that made subcontractors move faster and silenced a rowdy job site in seconds. They both stopped in their tracks and turned, looking more annoyed than anything else. "Get in the car," I ordered. "We are going to the old office downtown." Brandon rolled his eyes, his expensive watch catching the dull winter light. "Dad, we can't. We have a tea time at the club in less than an hour, and I have a client dinner tonight. We can visit your dusty old shrine another day." "It wasn't a request, Brandon," I said, my voice hardening. "Mike found something. Your mother left something behind, and she specifically asked for both of you to be there." Justin let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Mom's been gone a year, Dad. What could she have possibly left? A recipe for pot roast." "Get in the car," I said, taking a step toward them. "Or I call Sarah Jenkins, the estate lawyer, right now, and we can discuss the terms of your headquarters lease. I still own the building, remember? That shut them up instantly. I gave them a sweetheart deal on the rent for Thorne Construction. They were essentially paying nothing. If I pulled that lease and charged them market value, their overhead would skyrocket overnight, and they knew it. "Fine," Brandon snapped, adjusting his silk tie with a jerky motion. "But let's take Justin's Mercedes. It's faster, and I'm not sitting in that old pickup truck of yours. It smells like sawdust and grease." We piled into Justin's silver Mercedes S-Class. The leather was soft, and the interior smelled of expensive cologne and attention so thick you could cut it with a saw. I sat in the passenger seat, while Brandon sat in the back, immediately returning to his phone to type furiously. I watched Justin drive. He was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. For a man supposedly running a successful firm, he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Sweat was actually beading on his forehead despite the car's perfect climate control. "Nice car," I said, watching the city buildings blur past the window. "Business must be booming." Justin nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yeah, Dad. Great. Booming. We have a lot of big projects in the pipeline. Government contracts. Big stuff." I shifted my legs, trying to get comfortable. My knee hit the glove compartment, and the latch popped open. A stack of papers spilled out onto the floor mat. Justin lunged for them, taking one hand off the wheel in a panic. "I got it, Dad. Don't touch that." But I was faster. I still had the reflexes of a man who had spent his life catching falling tools. I grabbed the top envelope. It wasn't a blueprint or a contract. It was a letter from the bank, and the header was printed in a stark, alarming red. Final notice of default. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I knew this bank. I had done business with them for 30 years. You didn't get a final notice unless you were months behind, unless you had ignored every warning letter they sent. I held the paper up so Justin could see it. Justin's eyes darted from the road to the letter, and his face went a sickly shade of gray. "What is this, Justin?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "Why is the bank threatening to repossess your car? I thought the company bought this outright." Justin swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "It's just a clerical error, Dad. A system glitch at the bank. They credited the payment to the wrong account. I'm sorting it out with the manager on Monday. Don't worry about it." He snatched the letter from my hand and shoved it back into the compartment, slamming it shut. A system glitch. I looked at him, then caught Brandon's eye in the rearview mirror. Brandon wasn't looking at us. He was staring out the window, chewing his thumbnail, a nervous habit he only had when he was lying through his teeth. In construction, you develop a sixth sense for when a structure is unsound. You can't always see the rot inside the support beams, but you can smell it. You can feel the floor give just a fraction of an inch when you step on it. Right then, sitting in that expensive Mercedes, I felt the floor giving way under my family. Eleanor had handled the books for 40 years. She knew where every single dollar went. If she had hidden a note behind a wall, it wasn't a recipe. She knew something was wrong. And looking at my sons, one sweating over a bank letter and the other hiding his face, I began to suspect they knew it too. We pulled up to the curb in front of the Thorne building, a sturdy brick structure I had bought back in the 80s. The second-floor windows were taped up for the renovation. Mike's white van was parked out front, 2 wheels up on the sidewalk. That wasn't like Mike. He was a stickler for rules and safety. We got out, the wind whipping around the brick corners. I looked up at the window of what used to be Eleanor's office. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move behind the glass. "Let's get this over with," Brandon muttered, buttoning his expensive coat. "I have a conference call at 3. I didn't answer him. I walked to the front door, unlocked it, and pushed it open. The lobby was empty and smelled of stale coffee and drywall dust. We took the stairs because the elevator had been out of order for weeks. Another thing my sons had promised to fix but hadn't. When we reached the second floor, a heavy, suffocating silence hit us. The door to Eleanor's office was propped open with a plastic bucket. Mike Kowalski was standing in the middle of the room. He was a big man, but he looked small right then, holding a crowbar in one hand with white knuckles. His face was pale and covered in a fine layer of white dust. Behind him, the east wall, the wall where Eleanor used to hang her degree and our wedding photo, was gone. In its place was a dark, gaping hole. Mike looked at me, then at Brandon, then at Justin. He didn't say hello. He just pointed the crowbar toward the hole. "You'd better look for yourself, Mr. Thorne," Mike said, his voice trembling. "And you boys, you'd better start praying." I stepped over the pile of shattered drywall and peered into the darkness, my contractor instincts kicking in immediately. I knew the structural integrity of this building better than I knew the lines on my own palms. I had framed this place in 1982 and supervised the pouring of every cubic yard of concrete. According to the blueprints I drew myself, there should not have been a space here. Between the load-bearing column and the exterior brick facade, there was supposed to be nothing but insulation and a small gap for HVAC ducts. But as Mike's flashlight cut through the floating dust, it illuminated a space that was at least 4 feet deep, a perfectly framed hidden closet. I ran my hand along a stud, noting that the lumber was newer than the building's original skeleton. Someone had modified the layout years after construction, doing it professionally and quietly. I looked at Mike, who was shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "You did this," I said, knowing it wasn't a question. Mike nodded slowly, explaining that 2 years ago, Eleanor had called him on a Sunday and paid him triple to work at night. She made him swear on his mother's grave that he would never tell a soul, especially me. She told him she was protecting the legacy. Those words hung in the stale, dusty air like thick smoke. Eleanor was the most transparent person I knew, or so I had thought for 40 years. I stepped fully into the cramped, cold space, which smelled of old paper and steel. Bolted to the concrete subfloor was an old-school Titan commercial-grade safe with a mechanical dial and thick steel walls. Next to it sat a fireproof filing cabinet. I felt Brandon and Justin crowding into the opening behind me, their expensive cologne mixing with the smell of gypsum dust. "Why did Mom have a bunker in her office?" Brandon asked, his voice tight. Justin let out a nervous laugh, wondering if she was a doomsday prepper. I ignored them both. My eyes were fixed on a piece of cream-colored stationery taped to the safe. I recognized Eleanor's elegant handwriting instantly. It read, "Open this only when Harrison, Brandon, and Justin are standing together." Brandon pushed past me, his shoulder bumping mine hard. He stared at the safe with a flicker of pure, raw greed in his eyes, the look of a drowning man who just spotted a life raft. "Mom was hiding cash," he whispered, rattling the handle violently. "What's the combination, Dad?" I swatted his hand away, telling him to stop acting like a vulture. Justin leaned in, suggesting that if there was cash, we needed to deposit it into the corporate account for tax purposes. He was lying. I could hear the tremor in his voice. He didn't care about taxes. He cared about the foreclosure notice I had seen in his car. I looked at the dial. Eleanor was sentimental about dates. I tried her birthday and our wedding anniversary, but nothing worked. Brandon suggested the business incorporation date or Justin's birthday, but I knew Eleanor better than that. I closed my eyes and remembered a rainy afternoon in April 1974. She was a waitress paying her way through school, and I was just a young framer with calloused hands. April 12, 1974, the day she spilled coffee on my boots and laughed. I turned the dial, left to 4, right to 1, left to 2, right to 7, left to 4. The mechanical tumblers clicked with a heavy, satisfying metallic clunk. I pulled the handle, and the heavy door swung open on well-oiled hinges. It wasn't a mountain of cash inside. On the bottom shelf sat 6 gold bars, kilogram bars that gleamed with an unmistakable heavy luster. At current prices, it was roughly $12,000. Not enough to save a failing company, but significant nonetheless. My eyes, however, were drawn to the shelf above the gold. Sitting there was an old Sony digital voice recorder and a thick expandable file folder bulging with documents. A red label was stuck to the front cover in Eleanor's handwriting. "Phoenix." Brandon shouted and lunged forward, ignoring the papers entirely. He grabbed 2 gold bars, his hands shaking. "I told you she was hoarding assets." Justin reached for the others, claiming they could liquidate the gold tomorrow to buy time. "Stop it," I roared, my voice echoing in the hollow space. "Put it down. This isn't what she wanted you to see. The gold is a distraction." I grabbed the file folder and the recorder, pulling them to my chest. Brandon froze, and when he saw the Phoenix label, his face went from flushed to chalk white. Justin saw it too and dropped a gold bar, which hit the concrete floor with a dull, heavy thud. "Give me that file," Brandon said, his voice dropping an octave as his charm vanished. He claimed it was company property, and that as the current owners, it belonged to him and Justin. "You sold the company, Dad. You have no legal right to those documents." I clutched the folder tighter. This wasn't the company archives. It was hidden in a secret wall in a safe only I could open. "This is personal," I said. Brandon stepped closer, encroaching on my space. He was terrified of what was in that folder. He argued that Mom was the CFO, and if those were financial records, they needed them for an audit. Justin moved to flank me, pleading with me not to be difficult and saying they were just trying to protect me. Eleanor didn't make mistakes. She was a human calculator. If she hid this, she did it for a reason. Seeing the sweat on Brandon's upper lip, I knew that reason was serious. "I'm taking this home," I said firmly. "I'm going to read it and listen to this tape." As I turned to walk away, Brandon grabbed my arm with a hard, painful grip. "Give it to me, old man," he snarled. The disrespect felt like a slap in the face. Greed had stripped away his civility. He told Justin to grab the folder, warning him that if the file got out, they were ruined. Before Justin could move, Mike Kowalski stepped between us like a concrete barrier. He held his crowbar lazily in one hand, but his size alone, 6'4" and 250 pounds of muscle, was enough. "I wouldn't do that, boys," Mike said in a low, calm voice. "Your daddy hired me to do a job, and the lady of the house left him a note. I think you should let him read his mail." Brandon released my arm and stepped back, his hands trembling. He tried to regain his dignity, warning me that I was making a huge mistake and would only misinterpret modern financial instruments. "I understand enough," I said. "I understand that honest men don't sweat when they see a folder." I told them to keep the gold and split it between them as an early inheritance. I just wanted the truth. Brandon shoved the gold bars into his coat pockets and threatened to sue me for corporate espionage if I showed the papers to anyone. He stormed out, followed by a terrified Justin who whispered for me to just burn the file. I stood there in the dust-filled office, my heart hammering. Mike told me Eleanor was a good woman who had helped his daughter with tuition, and he felt he owed it to her to make sure I saw these papers. I watched my sons get into their car, arguing and hitting the steering wheel. Phoenix, the mythical bird that rises from the ashes. But to rise, something first has to burn. Looking at my sons, I had a terrible feeling that the burning was only just beginning. I tucked the file under my coat, gripped the recorder, and walked toward the stairs. I needed to go home and hear what Eleanor had been trying to tell me. But as I reached the landing, Brandon and Justin were there, blocking my path. They had regrouped. Brandon's rage was gone, replaced by a mask of concern he used when selling bad stocks. "Dad, wait," he said in a soothing, patronizing tone. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have yelled." He stepped closer, crowding me against the banister while Justin shifted nervously behind him. "Look, Dad," Brandon continued, his voice dripping with fake empathy. "Mom wasn't herself those last few years. She was paranoid." He claimed she thought the government was spying on her and that her illness was the reason for the hidden wall and the gold. He urged me to give him the file so their lawyers could fix her mistakes quietly and protect her reputation from the IRS. For a fraction of a second, I almost believed him. But then I looked down at the folder. The cover slid open slightly, and I saw a logo embossed on the top document. Cayman Islands Offshore Holdings Limited. My stomach turned over. Eleanor was the daughter of a cop. She balanced her checkbook to the penny and lectured me about claiming personal dinners as business expenses. She wouldn't hide money in the Caymans because she was confused. She would only do it if she was forced, or if she was gathering evidence against someone who was. I looked at Brandon. He was sweating, and his eyes were terrified. He wasn't trying to protect his mother. He was trying to bury her testimony. I stood there in the narrow hallway, the air thick with the smell of drywall dust and the lingering scent of my son's expensive cologne. Brandon and Justin hadn't left. They had simply regrouped at the top of the stairs like wolves waiting for a wounded deer. The rage that had twisted Brandon's face in the office was gone now, replaced by a mask of deep, practiced concern. The kind he usually reserved for elderly widows when he was trying to sell them a bad investment. He held up his hands, palms open, trying to look like the reasonable person in the room. "Dad, wait," he said, his voice dropping into a soothing, almost patronizing tone. "Please just stop for a second. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have yelled. It's been a hard year for all of us." He took a step closer, crowding me against the banister, while Justin stood just behind him, looking at his shoes and shifting his weight like a kid caught in the principal's office. Brandon continued, his tone dripping with a fake empathy that made my skin crawl. He told me that they were worried about me, that they hadn't wanted to burden me while I was grieving, but that Eleanor hadn't been herself in those final years. "What are you talking about, Brandon?" I asked, tightening my grip on the file folder. I looked at the dial. Eleanor was sentimental about dates. I tried her birthday and our wedding anniversary, but nothing worked. Brandon suggested the business incorporation date or Justin's birthday, but I knew Eleanor better than that. I closed my eyes and remembered a rainy afternoon in April 1974. She was a waitress paying her way through school, and I was just a young framer with calloused hands. April 12, 1974, the day she spilled coffee on my boots and laughed. I turned the dial, left to 4, right to 1, left to 2, right to 7, left to 4. The mechanical tumblers clicked with a heavy, satisfying metallic clunk. I pulled the handle, and the heavy door swung open on well-oiled hinges. It wasn't a mountain of cash inside. On the bottom shelf sat 6 gold bars, kilogram bars that gleamed with an unmistakable heavy luster. At current prices, it was roughly $12,000. Not enough to save a failing company, but significant nonetheless. My eyes, however, were drawn to the shelf above the gold. Sitting there was an old Sony digital voice recorder and a thick expandable file folder bulging with documents. A red label was stuck to the front cover in Eleanor's handwriting. "Phoenix." Brandon shouted and lunged forward, ignoring the papers entirely. He grabbed 2 gold bars, his hands shaking. "I told you she was hoarding assets." Justin reached for the others, claiming they could liquidate the gold tomorrow to buy time. "Stop it," I roared, my voice echoing in the hollow space. "Put it down. This isn't what she wanted you to see. The gold is a distraction." I grabbed the file folder and the recorder, pulling them to my chest. Brandon froze, and when he saw the Phoenix label, his face went from flushed to chalk white. Justin saw it too and dropped a gold bar, which hit the concrete floor with a dull, heavy thud. "Give me that file," Brandon said, his voice dropping an octave as his charm vanished. He claimed it was company property, and that as the current owners, it belonged to him and Justin. "You sold the company, Dad. You have no legal right to those documents." I clutched the folder tighter. This wasn't the company archives. It was hidden in a secret wall in a safe only I could open. "This is personal," I said. Brandon stepped closer, encroaching on my space. He was terrified of what was in that folder. He argued that Mom was the CFO, and if those were financial records, they needed them for an audit. Justin moved to flank me, pleading with me not to be difficult and saying they were just trying to protect me. Eleanor didn't make mistakes. She was a human calculator. If she hid this, she did it for a reason. Seeing the sweat on Brandon's upper lip, I knew that reason was serious. "I'm taking this home," I said firmly. "I'm going to read it and listen to this tape." As I turned to walk away, Brandon grabbed my arm with a hard, painful grip. "Give it to me, old man," he snarled. The disrespect felt like a slap in the face. Greed had stripped away his civility. He told Justin to grab the folder, warning him that if the file got out, they were ruined. Before Justin could move, Mike Kowalski stepped between us like a concrete barrier. He held his crowbar lazily in one hand, but his size alone, 6'4" and 250 pounds of muscle, was enough. "I wouldn't do that, boys," Mike said in a low, calm voice. "Your daddy hired me to do a job, and the lady of the house left him a note. I think you should let him read his mail." Brandon released my arm and stepped back, his hands trembling. He tried to regain his dignity, warning me that I was making a huge mistake and would only misinterpret modern financial instruments. "I understand enough," I said. "I understand that honest men don't sweat when they see a folder." I told them to keep the gold and split it between them as an early inheritance. I just wanted the truth. Brandon shoved the gold bars into his coat pockets and threatened to sue me for corporate espionage if I showed the papers to anyone. He stormed out, followed by a terrified Justin who whispered for me to just burn the file. I stood there in the dust-filled office, my heart hammering. Mike told me Eleanor was a good woman who had helped his daughter with tuition, and he felt he owed it to her to make sure I saw these papers. I watched my sons get into their car, arguing and hitting the steering wheel. Phoenix, the mythical bird that rises from the ashes. But to rise, something first has to burn. Looking at my sons, I had a terrible feeling that the burning was only just beginning. I tucked the file under my coat, gripped the recorder, and walked toward the stairs. I needed to go home and hear what Eleanor had been trying to tell me. But as I reached the landing, Brandon and Justin were there, blocking my path. They had regrouped. Brandon's rage was gone, replaced by a mask of concern he used when selling bad stocks. "Dad, wait," he said in a soothing, patronizing tone. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have yelled." He stepped closer, crowding me against the banister while Justin shifted nervously behind him. "Look, Dad," Brandon continued, his voice dripping with fake empathy. "Mom wasn't herself those last few years. She was paranoid." He claimed she thought the government was spying on her and that her illness was the reason for the hidden wall and the gold. He urged me to give him the file so their lawyers could fix her mistakes quietly and protect her reputation from the IRS. For a fraction of a second, I almost believed him. But then I looked down at the folder. The cover slid open slightly, and I saw a logo embossed on the top document. Cayman Islands Offshore Holdings Limited. My stomach turned over. Eleanor was the daughter of a cop. She balanced her checkbook to the penny and lectured me about claiming personal dinners as business expenses. She wouldn't hide money in the Caymans because she was confused. She would only do it if she was forced, or if she was gathering evidence against someone who was. I looked at Brandon. He was sweating, and his eyes were terrified. He wasn't trying to protect his mother. He was trying to bury her testimony. I stood there in the narrow hallway, the air thick with the smell of drywall dust and the lingering scent of my son's expensive cologne. Brandon and Justin hadn't left. They had simply regrouped at the top of the stairs like wolves waiting for a wounded deer. The rage that had twisted Brandon's face in the office was gone now, replaced by a mask of deep, practiced concern. The kind he usually reserved for elderly widows when he was trying to sell them a bad investment. He held up his hands, palms open, trying to look like the reasonable person in the room. "Dad, wait," he said, his voice dropping into a soothing, almost patronizing tone. "Please just stop for a second. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have yelled. It's been a hard year for all of us." He took a step closer, crowding me against the banister, while Justin stood just behind him, looking at his shoes and shifting his weight like a kid caught in the principal's office. Brandon continued, his tone dripping with a fake empathy that made my skin crawl. He told me that they were worried about me, that they hadn't wanted to burden me while I was grieving, but that Eleanor hadn't been herself in those final years. "What are you talking about, Brandon?" I asked, tightening my grip on the file folder. I stopped the tape. The silence in the room was deafening. Forgery. Embezzlement. My sons weren't just failures. They were criminals who had stolen from the very people who built our legacy. I opened the Phoenix file. The first page was a summary in Eleanor's neat hand. $8 million siphoned out in 36 months. I flipped through the bank transfers and contracts. Being a contractor for 40 years, I could read a bid sheet in my sleep, and I saw the fraud instantly. Invoices for roof repairs and HVAC upgrades on buildings I knew were fine, written in round numbers, $250, 000 even. There are never round numbers in construction. There is always tax, labor, and cents. I looked up the addresses for the subcontractors listed. One was a UPS store in Indiana. Another was a vacant lot behind a liquor store. Shell companies. They were writing checks to themselves and dumping the money into a black hole of debt. Then I saw the mortgage document for my office building. The lender was a company called Janus Capital. I recognized the name from the news. It was a front for an organized crime syndicate in Chicago. And there at the bottom was my signature, Harrison J. Thorne. It looked perfect, the slant, the loop, but the date was from 14 months ago when I was in Florida visiting my sister. They had sold me out. They had sold everything I worked for to criminals to cover their addictions. Eleanor knew they were too shallow to look past the gold bars, so she bought the gold as bait to keep them away from this file. I felt a wave of nausea. They hadn't been grieving at the church. They were terrified because Eleanor was the only one who knew where the bodies were buried. I looked at the clock. It was past 11 p.m. I felt old, and I felt the weight of every mistake I'd made in raising them. I had created this by bailing them out every time they failed. Suddenly, the doorbell shattered the silence. Ding dong, ding dong. Someone was leaning on the button, urgent and desperate. I froze, my hand going to the drawer where I kept my old revolver. I moved through the shadows to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing there, shivering in the yellow porch light, was Megan, Brandon's wife. Her mascara was running in black streaks, and she was sobbing. "Open the door, Harrison," she cried through the wood. "Please, they're going to ruin us. Give it back before he does something stupid." I stared at her. Megan was an actress. She knew how to use tears as a weapon. Was she genuinely afraid, or was she the next phase of the con? I stood there with my hand hovering over the heavy oak door, listening to the muffled, desperate sobs coming from the other side. Through the small glass peephole, the yellow porch light cast Megan's face in a sickly, jaundiced glow. She looked like a wreck. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her mascara had run into long, dark streaks that made her look like she was wearing a mask of grief. But I knew Megan. She was a woman who had spent her 20s trying to make it as an actress, and she knew exactly how to use her tears as a battering ram when she wanted something. She pounded on the wood again, harder this time. In this quiet, suburban neighborhood, where the loudest sound at night was usually the hum of a neighbor's sprinkler system, her screaming was likely to bring the police in minutes. I wanted Brandon and his brother arrested, but I wanted it done on my terms, not because of a late-night domestic disturbance call. I took a breath, unlatched the chain, and pulled the door open. Megan didn't just walk in. She collapsed. She fell to her knees on the entryway rug, her expensive designer coat pooling around her as she clutched at the hem of my trousers. "Oh, Dad, thank God," she wailed, her voice thick and performative. "You have to help him. Brandon is talking crazy. He says he's going to leave the country. He says his life is over." I looked down at her, feeling a cold detachment. If I hadn't spent the last hour listening to Eleanor's voice on that recorder, I might have actually felt a spark of sympathy for her. "Get up, Megan," I said, my voice flat and unimpressed. "You're ruining your coat." She sniffled loudly, rising slowly and brushing off her knees. Then, she reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out a plastic container that was still warm to the touch. "I brought you this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Chicken soup. I made it myself. I know how much you love it, and I thought you might forget to eat with everything going on." I stared at the container, and a warning bell went off in the back of my mind. In the 10 years she had been married to my son, I had never once seen Megan boil a pot of water. Their kitchen was a showpiece of marble and stainless steel that existed solely for the purpose of reheating takeout from the most expensive restaurants in the city. The idea of her chopping carrots and simmering broth was about as likely as me taking up ballet at 73. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. I led her toward the kitchen, making sure to steer her away from the study where the Phoenix file was still sitting under the glow of my desk lamp. As we walked, I noticed her eyes weren't on me. They were darting into the shadows, scanning the rooms, looking for that folder. We sat at the kitchen island, the soup container sitting between us like a prop in a play. Megan leaned forward, her fingers cold as she touched my hand. "Dad, Brandon is having a breakdown," she whispered. "He says you have documents that could hurt a lot of innocent people. If Eleanor left something behind, something she wrote when she wasn't thinking clearly, is it really fair to use that against your own son?" I pulled my hand away, the anger beginning to burn in my chest. "Eleanor was always thinking clearly, Megan. Right up until the end." Megan let out a long, shuddering sigh. "I know you loved her, but those last few months, she was different. She told me she was worried about the government and moving money around to protect it from taxes. She said if anything happened, we should burn her files to protect the family. It was a coordinated attack. Brandon must have coached her before sending her over, hoping they could rewrite the history of Eleanor's final days to make her look like the criminal." I looked at the soup, and suddenly, a specific memory scratched at my brain. About 18 months ago, Eleanor had started getting sick. It wasn't the stroke that eventually killed her, but she had suffered from these terrible spells of dizziness, nausea, and stomach cramps that the doctors couldn't explain. Now, looking at the homemade soup, I remembered Eleanor mentioning a strange, metallic taste in her mouth. I had dismissed it then as a side effect of her medication, but I realized now that she only ever felt that way after Sunday dinners at Brandon's house or after Megan brought over one of her wellness smoothies. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You know what?" I said, forcing a tired, fake smile. "That actually smells good, but I need to wash the office dust off my hands first." Megan's face lit up with relief. "Of course, Dad. Go wash up. I'll find a bowl." I walked out of the kitchen and into the hallway powder room. I locked the door and turned the faucet on high, letting the water roar to create a wall of noise. I waited 30 seconds, then quietly opened the door. I stepped out of my boots so I could move silently in my socks and crept back down the hallway, avoiding the floorboard that I knew always squeaked. The kitchen was empty. I moved toward the study, where the door was slightly ajar. I peered through the crack and saw Megan standing at my desk. She wasn't crying anymore. She was working with the cold efficiency of a professional thief. She had the Phoenix file open, and she was using her smartphone to take high-resolution photos of every single page. She would snap a picture, turn the page, and wait for the camera to focus again. Her face, illuminated by the glow of the screen, was that of a predator. She was already through the bank transfers and was moving on to the forged mortgage document. I felt a mixture of horror and validation. My instincts had been right. She wasn't here to feed me. She was here to gather intelligence so Brandon could cover his tracks. I stepped back into the hallway, took a deep breath, and let out a loud, rattling cough. Then, I stepped into the room and flipped the light switch to full brightness. Megan jumped so hard she nearly dropped her phone. She spun around, trying to shove the device behind her back in a clumsy attempt to hide it. She looked like a deer caught in high beams. "Dad," she stammered, her voice pitching high. "I was just looking for a napkin for the soup." I looked at the open file on my desk, then back at her. "In my private study? Inside a confidential file." Megan tried to form another lie, but she saw the look on my face, the look of a man who was done being played. I walked to the desk, closed the file slowly, and slipped the voice recorder into my pocket. "Get out," I said, my voice icy. "Dad, I can explain. Get out of my house," I repeated louder this time. "Take your soup and your lies with you, and tell your husband that if he sends you here again, I'm adding trespassing to the list of charges I'm filing tomorrow." The mask of the concerned daughter-in-law crumbled instantly, leaving behind a look of pure, concentrated venom. "You're a bitter, lonely old man, Harrison," she spat. "You're going to die alone in this empty house, and you'll deserve it." She marched past me, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood as she slammed the front door behind her. I locked the deadbolt and the secondary latch, watching from the window as she sped away, likely texting Brandon the photos she had managed to take. I went back to the kitchen and looked at the soup container with total revulsion. I carried it to the back door and dumped the thick, yellow liquid into the dirt at the edge of the woods. It smelled overly pungent, as if she had used too many herbs to mask a bitter, chemical taste. I went back inside and scrubbed my hands with hot water and soap until they were red. I felt violated in my own home. I sat back down at my desk, my hands finally steady with a cold, hard resolve. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Sarah Jenkins." The voice answered on the third ring. "Sarah, it's Harrison Thorne," I said. "Harrison? It's nearly midnight. Is everything okay?" "No, Sarah. Everything is wrong. I need to open a file. A big 1-inch. "What kind of file?" she asked, her tone shifting into professional gear. I looked at the Phoenix folder and the empty spot on the wall where Eleanor's picture used to hang. "Litigation," I said. "I need to freeze the company assets, file an emergency injunction against my sons, and I need a forensic accountant on the clock tonight." There was a long pause, and then Sarah's voice came back, sharp and hungry. "Start talking, Harrison." "I'm grabbing a pen." I told her everything, the forgery, the gambling, the Cayman accounts, and the arsenic. As I spoke, I felt the old Harrison Thorne, the man who had weathered Union wars and built skyscrapers, coming back to life. My wife had left me a weapon from beyond the grave, and I was finally ready to use it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my armchair, watching the street through the curtains, knowing that a storm was heading for my front door. At 8:15 the next morning, 2 black SUVs pulled into my driveway, parking aggressively to block my exit. Brandon and Justin got out, looking haggard but determined. With them was a man I didn't recognize. A short, balding man in an expensive suit with the predatory walk of a lawyer who enjoyed every second of a fight. I didn't go to the door. I went to the kitchen, poured a cup of cold coffee, and waited for them to come to me. They used their keys to enter without knocking. Their footsteps were heavy and authoritative as they marched into my kitchen like a SWAT team. "Dad," Brandon said, his voice tight, "we need to talk." "Good morning, son," I said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "Who's your friend?" The lawyer stepped forward, placing a briefcase on the island. "Mr. Thorne, my name is Richard Sterling. I am representing your sons in a matter regarding your health and the future of the Thorne estate. I knew the name. Sterling was a corporate shark known for hostile takeovers. He clicked the latches of his briefcase, and the sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick document and slid it toward me. The title was in bold, black letters, Petition for Emergency Temporary Conservatorship. I looked at the words and felt a chill go straight to my marrow. Conservatorship, it was the legal equivalent of being buried alive. It meant losing every right I had as an adult, the right to drive, to sign a check, to make my own medical decisions. It meant becoming a child in the eyes of the law. What is this? I asked. It's a solution, Brandon said, stepping up beside the lawyer. A solution to a problem that's become too big to ignore. You dead. You are the problem. Sterling cleared his throat. Mr. Thorne, your family is deeply concerned about your mental decline. In the last 24 hours, you've exhibited erratic behavior. You assaulted your son at the office, you stole sensitive documents, and last night, he paused, looking at his notes. Last night, your daughter-in-law witnessed you engaging in paranoid delusions. You were talking to inanimate objects, a voice recorder, and you accused your family of poisoning you. You destroyed perfectly good food, claiming it was tainted. Megan had done her job well. She had twisted the truth into a clinical diagnosis. This is ridiculous, I said. Paranoia, Sterling said, tapping the paper. A classic symptom of dementia aggravated by grief. We have a statement from a psychiatrist, Dr. Evans, who is prepared to testify that you represent an imminent danger to yourself. I looked at Brandon. You're going to commit me? Your own father. We found a place. Silver Lake, Brandon said, his voice trembling with fake emotion. It's high-end. You'll have nurses and a view of the garden. You can rest there, and we will handle everything else. Silver Lake. I knew the place. It was a warehouse for the wealthy unwanted where they medicated you into a zombie state so you wouldn't complain. It was a prison with nice curtains. And if I refuse? I asked. Sterling leaned forward. Then we file this with the court this afternoon. We'll get an emergency order, and the sheriff will escort you to a psychiatric hold for a 72-hour evaluation. From there, it gets much harder to leave. The threat was clear. Sign the voluntary power of attorney giving them control, or they would drag me out in handcuffs in front of the neighbors. They would strip me of my dignity before they stripped me of my assets. I looked at the document. It was a total surrender. If I signed it, the Phoenix file would be burned before the ink was dry. I looked at Justin, who was standing by the fridge, looking pale and guilty. He knew this was wrong, but he was drowning in debt and saw this paper as his only life jacket. I need a moment, I said. We don't have a moment, Brandon snapped. The bank and the investors are waiting. We need to stabilize the company. I stood up slowly, letting my hand tremble as I leaned on the counter. I was shaking with rage, but I channeled it into a performance of frailty. I let my shoulders slump and my mouth hang open. I became the old man they wanted to see. I can't think, I stammered. Eleanor. She would know what to do. Just sign it, Harrison, Sterling said, pushing a gold pen toward me. It's for the best. I reached for the pen, my hand shaking violently. I held it over the signature line, and I saw Brandon hold his breath in anticipation. He was so close to winning. I dropped the pen. It clattered onto the document, leaving a small ink stain. I can't, I whispered, sinking back onto the stool. Not without making my peace. What are you talking about? Brandon demanded. I need to confess, I said, looking up at him with watery eyes. If I'm going away, I need to talk to Father Mike at St. Mary's. I have sins, Brandon. I need one day to set my soul right, then I'll sign. Brandon groaned in frustration, but Justin broke. Come on, let him have a day. His dad. If we force him now, he might have a heart attack. Sterling checked his watch. 24 hours doesn't change much. A voluntary signature is always stronger than a contested one. If we wait, it's bulletproof. Brandon ground his teeth. Fine. 24 hours. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., we come back, you sign, and we pack your bags. But he wasn't going to leave me alone. Justin stays here. He'll watch you. Make sure you don't leave or make any calls. I looked at Justin, a jailer I could work with. That's fine. I like Justin. Brandon grabbed the papers. Justin, lock the doors. Take his phone. Nobody comes in or out. He turned to me one last time. Don't try anything, Dad. One wrong move and the men in white coats come early. I nodded, looking defeated. I promise. Just let me pray. Brandon and Sterling marched out, and I heard the lock click. I was alone with my jailer. Justin pulled the landline out of the wall and took my cell phone from my pocket. I'm sorry, Dad, he mumbled. It's just, we have to do this. I'm fine, Justin, I said softly. I walked into my study to pray, while Justin sat on the couch, blocking the front door and scrolling through his phone. I had 23.5 hours left before my life ended. I sat at my desk and looked at the heavy steel safe Mike had brought over. Brandon hadn't checked it. I told him it was just old tools. I reached into my pocket and felt the small silver key. It was time to see what Eleanor had really left me. I sat in the silence of my study, the heavy mahogany desk feeling more like a fortress than a piece of furniture. Outside the door, I could hear the rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of Justin eating a bag of chips while he sat on the leather sofa, his eyes probably glued to some sports highlight reel. He was my son, yet he had become my warden, a man paid in the currency of his own debts to keep his father a prisoner in the house I had built with my own 2 hands. It was a bitter realization, one that tasted like the cold, dregs-filled coffee sitting in the mug on my desk. Justin thought he was the one in control, but he had always been lazy. He believed that because he had disconnected the landline and taken my cell phone, I was cut off from the world. He didn't realize that in this game of cat and mouse, his mother had been the one to set the board. Eleanor had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else, and even from the grave, she was still moving the pieces. I looked over at the heavy steel safe sitting in the corner, still covered by the dusty wool blanket I'd used to hide it from Brandon's greedy eyes. Brandon had dismissed it as a box of old tools, and in his arrogance, he hadn't bothered to look closer. I reached into my pocket and felt the small silver key Mike had slipped me. The key to the false bottom. I'm going to my study to pray, Justin, I had told him. Just leave the door open, Dad. I need to see you, he had grumbled back, not even looking up from his screen. I sat on the floor, my 73-year-old knees screaming in protest as they pressed into the Persian rug. I moved slowly, making sure my shadow didn't give me away. I slid off the chair and crawled across the floor, my breath hitching as I reached the safe. I ran my fingers along the interior's bottom edge, searching for the seam Mike had mentioned. It was nearly invisible, a hairline crack in the steel plating. I found the tiny pinhole and inserted the silver key. With a smooth, silent click, a secondary plate popped up just an inch. I lifted it away, revealing a shallow compartment lined with dark velvet. Resting inside was an iPad. It was an older model, its screen slightly dusty, but it was connected to a portable battery pack that showed a faint, reassuring green charge light. Eleanor had planned for this. She knew that power could be cut, that my phone could be taken, and that I might be trapped. She had built a digital life raft. I pressed the home button, and the screen flared to life. There was no passcode, just a single app icon on the background. A generic security camera monitor. I tapped it, and my heart nearly stopped when the screen split into a grid of 4 live video feeds. I recognized the rooms immediately. 2 Christmases ago, Eleanor had insisted on installing top-of-the-line baby monitors and security systems in the boys' homes. Brandon had laughed at her, calling her overprotective, but he had let her pay for it. He didn't know that his mother had kept the master administrative key. The top left feed was Brandon's living room. The top right was his kitchen. The bottom 2 feeds were from Justin's apartment. I tapped the feed for Brandon's kitchen, expanding the image to fill the screen. The video was high definition, so crisp I could see the condensation on the marble countertops. Brandon was there. He was pacing his kitchen, a tumbler of my expensive scotch in one hand, his phone pressed to his ear with the other. I quickly muted the volume, terrified Justin would hear the audio from the hallway, then turned it back up to a whisper, holding the tablet against my ear. "Yeah, I know he's stalling." Brandon's voice crackled through the tiny speakers. He sounded agitated but triumphant. "Stop worrying. He's broken. I saw his face. He's going to sign tomorrow morning." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. I knew it had to be Megan. "No, we're not sending him to Silver Lake," Brandon said, and then he laughed. A cruel, jagged sound that made my blood run cold. "Are you kidding me? That place costs $10,000 a month. I'm not wasting our inheritance on luxury sheets for a vegetable." My own son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the man I had given a multimillion-dollar company to, was calling me a vegetable. "I found a place in Gary," Brandon continued, taking a long swig of the scotch. "State-run. It smells like bleach and boiled cabbage, but it's secure. Once I have the power of attorney, he goes there. Nobody will ever look for him." The betrayal felt like a physical blow to the stomach. It wasn't just greed anymore. It was total, cold-blooded disposal. He was planning to lock me away in a hellhole and throw away the key. "And hey, babe," Brandon said, his tone shifting into something even more sinister. "You need to keep up with the supplements. Yeah, the arsenic. Just a little. Dr. Evans says if he's disoriented when he signs, it's better." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking so violently the image became a blur. Arsenic. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The stomach cramps Eleanor had suffered, the dizziness, the strange metallic taste she had complained about. They had been poisoning her. They hadn't pulled a trigger, but they had weakened her body and broken her heart until she simply couldn't fight anymore. And now they were doing the exact same thing to me. The homemade soup Megan had brought was nothing but a slow-acting death warrant. "But don't kill him yet," Brandon warned the person on the phone. "We need him breathing until the house sells. If he dies before the transfer, the estate goes into probate and the creditors will swarm us. We need the cash first." They were keeping me alive just long enough to rob me blind. I looked at the iPad. This was it, the smoking gun, the confession, the evidence of intent to commit murder and fraud. I needed to get this information out of the house, and I needed to get myself out of the house. I minimized the camera app and opened the email client. My fingers fumbled over the touch screen as I typed a frantic message to the only person in this city I still trusted. Mike Kowalski. Subject: Code Red. Message: "I'm trapped. Justin is guarding the doors. I have proof. They are poisoning me. I need out. Second floor master bath window. Now." I hit send and watched the little progress bar crawl across the top of the screen. Sent. I slipped the iPad under my sweater, tucking it firmly into the waistband of my trousers. Then, I reached for the Phoenix file folder in the desk drawer. It was bulky, but I buttoned my cardigan over it, hoping the loose fabric would hide the sharp corners of the documents. I stood up and took a long, deep breath. I had to walk past my jailer. I stepped out of the study and into the hallway. Justin looked up from the couch, a bag of chips resting on his stomach and crumbs spilling onto his expensive trousers. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice muffled by a mouthful of food. "Upstairs," I said, making sure to keep my voice sounding raspy, weak, and defeated. "I need to use the bathroom, and I want to lie down for a bit before I pray. I'm not feeling well." I let my shoulders slump and leaned heavily against the door frame. I gave him the image of the vegetable Brandon wanted me to be. Justin scrutinized me for a second, then grunted and turned back to his phone. "Make it quick. And don't try anything, Dad. I took the knobs off the bedroom doors years ago, remember? You can't lock yourself in." He was right. Eleanor had changed the hardware during a renovation, but he had forgotten one thing. "I just need to rest, son," I whispered. I walked up the stairs, one agonizing step at a time, gripping the banister as if it were the only thing keeping me on this earth. I counted them in my head. 1, 2, 3. As soon as I reached the landing and turned the corner out of Justin's sight, the act dropped. I moved with a speed I didn't know I still possessed. I went into the master bedroom and grabbed my wallet, my spare keys, and a heavier jacket. Then I moved into the master bathroom. It sat at the very back of the house, overlooking the garden and the alleyway. I walked in and locked the door. It was the only door in the house with a working lock that Justin hadn't disabled. I turned on the shower at full blast, the roar of the water creating a wall of white noise that would cover any sound I was about to make. I went to the window, a double-hung sash window that was old and sticky with decades of paint. I pushed up on the latch, but it resisted. I gritted my teeth, planting my feet and using my legs for leverage. With a sharp groan of protesting wood, it finally slid upward. The cold afternoon air hit my face, sharp and clear. I looked down. It was a 20-foot drop to the concrete patio below. For a man of 73, it would be a suicide jump. But then I saw it. Rising out of the shadows like a skeleton made of steel was a construction scaffold. It was set up right against the back wall, reaching almost to the bathroom windowsill. "Mike," I breathed. 2 weeks ago, I had mentioned to Mike that the gutters were clogged and the brickwork needed some attention. He had set up the staging, but we hadn't started the work because of the anniversary. He hadn't taken it down yet. It was still there, wrapped in safety netting with a metal ladder leading all the way to the ground. "God bless you, Mike Kowalski," I whispered to the empty room. I climbed onto the toilet seat and swung one leg over the sill. The wind whipped at my cardigan as I gripped the window frame. This was the moment of no return. If I slipped now, I'd break a hip or worse. If Justin heard the window, it was over. I swung my other leg out, my foot searching through the air until it found the cold metal platform of the scaffold. It held. I transferred my weight, feeling the structure sway slightly under me. I was out. I grabbed the steel poles and began to descend, hand over hand, foot over foot. It was a movement I had performed 10,000 times in my youth on 1,000 different job sites. The muscle memory was still there, buried under the arthritis and the years. I wasn't just a prisoner. I was a builder, and I knew how to navigate a structure. I reached the ground, my boots hitting the soft earth of the flower bed. I crouched low in the shadows of the house. A figure stepped out from behind the large oak tree in the backyard. It was Mike. He was wearing dark coveralls and holding a tire iron, his face set in a grim expression. He put a finger to his lips and pointed toward the side gate, which he had already unlatched. We moved silently through the wet grass. Mike led me not to his white contractor van, which would be far too conspicuous, but to a beat-up sedan parked half a block away. It was his wife's car, smart. They would be looking for the work van, not this. I climbed into the passenger seat, my heart racing like a diesel engine. Mike got in and started the engine, but he didn't turn on the headlights until we were 2 streets away. "You got the email?" Mike asked, his eyes darting to the mirrors. I patted the iPad hidden under my sweater. "I got everything, Mike. The whole damn war plan." "Where to, Mr. Thorne?" Mike asked. "Take me to Sarah Jenkins," I said, "and step on it. We have a lot of work to do before the sun comes up." As we sped away from the neighborhood, I looked back toward my house. The lights were still on. Justin was still sitting on that couch, eating chips and watching a screen, guarding an empty cage. He thought he had won. He thought the old man was upstairs washing away his sins. He had no idea that the old man was gone, and that when I came back I was bringing a wrecking ball. Sarah Jenkins' office was perched on the 35th floor of a gleaming glass tower on Wacker Drive, with a view that looked straight down at the dark, winding Chicago River. It was the kind of place that felt heavy with the scent of polished mahogany, expensive leather, and the invisible weight of high-stakes billable hours. I hadn't set foot in this building since the day I transferred the deeds of my company over to my sons 5 years ago, a day I had once considered the proudest moment of my professional life. Now, walking in at 3 o'clock in the morning with Mike Kowalski by my side, looking like 2 fugitives on the run, it felt like I was entering a war room. Sarah didn't even blink at the sight of us. She was a pit bull in an Armani suit, a woman who had fought in the trenches with me during the Union Wars and zoning battles of the 90s. She buzzed us into a large, cold conference room where a coffee machine was already gurgling in the corner, and a young man with thick, wire-rimmed glasses was buried under a mountain of spreadsheets and digital printouts. "This is David," Sarah said, locking the door behind us with a sharp click. "He's a forensic accountant I keep on retainer for the kind of cases that require a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. I woke him up an hour ago. He's been reviewing the scans Megan accidentally provided last night." David didn't look up immediately. His fingers were flying across a laptop keyboard, his eyes darting between screens like a gamer in the middle of a tournament. When he finally spoke, his voice was dry, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. The voice of a man who saw the entire world as nothing more than a series of columns and rows. "Mr. Thorne," David said, finally adjusting his glasses and turning a screen toward me. "I've gone through the Phoenix file documents you uploaded. I've cross-referenced them with public records, state filings, and the National Construction Database. Your wife wasn't just thorough. She was meticulous. She didn't just find the smoking gun. She found the bullets, the casing, and the original receipt for the gunpowder." I sat down heavily at the head of the table, the leather chair groaning under my weight. "What's the damage, David? Give it to me straight." David took a breath. "The operating loss from the bad contracts isn't $8 million. That was just the tip of the iceberg. When you factor in the hidden leverage, the shadow loans, and the high-interest debt they took on to cover their tracks, the total debt load is $12 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. 12 million. You couldn't lose $12 million just by being bad at business. You had to work at it with a kind of dedicated malice." "How?" I whispered, staring at the screen. "It isn't just a gambling addiction, though that played a huge part," David explained, pulling up a complex flow chart that looked like a spiderweb. "Brandon isn't just an investor. He's been acting as a criminal facilitator. Those shell companies, Redstone LLC, Blue Sky Incorporated, they aren't just fake contractors. They're intake valves. They invoice Thorne Construction for materials that don't exist. Industrial lumber, high-grade copper wiring, steel beams. The company pays the invoice, the shell company keeps a 10% processing fee, and then they wire the rest of the cash to offshore accounts in the Caymans." He looked me in the eye, his expression grim. They're laundering money for a cross-state smuggling ring, Mr. Thorne. They're moving stolen construction materials across state lines and using your legacy to clean the cash. That mortgage they took out on your downtown office building, that wasn't to pay off a debt. That was the buy-in. That was Brandon putting up collateral to the syndicate to get a bigger cut of the laundering action. A wave of cold revulsion washed over me. The name Thorne had always stood for quality and integrity in this city. Now, my own sons had turned it into a laundromat for thieves. It gets worse, Sarah said, sliding a different printout across the table. We accessed the iCloud account associated with the iPad Eleanor hid. She was tracking Megan's online activity. Take a look at this. It was a digital receipt from a chemical supply website based in Mexico. The customer name was a generic Jane Doe, but the credit card used was a shell account directly linked to Megan's personal email address. Arsenic trioxide, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Industrial grade. It's odorless and tasteless, and if administered in small doses over a long period, it's highly effective. She bought 3 separate shipments, one 18 months ago, one 6 months ago, and one just last week. 18 months ago. That was exactly when Eleanor's health had started to decline. The stomach cramps, the dizzy spells, the confusion. They had been killing her right in front of me. They hadn't used a gun, but they had poisoned her slowly, spiking her blood pressure and weakening her heart until it finally gave out. And now they were doing the exact same thing to me. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the tiny lights of the city. I felt a rage so pure and white-hot it almost blinded me. I wanted to go back to that house and tear it down brick by brick. I wanted to hurt them the way they had hurt her. "We need to call the police," Mike rumbled from the corner, still clutching his tire iron as if he expected the door to be kicked in at any moment. "This is attempted murder. It's over." Sarah shook her head. "Not yet, Mike. The receipt proves Megan bought the chemicals, but it doesn't prove she gave them to Harrison. A high-priced lawyer like Richard Sterling will argue she bought it for a garden project or a rat problem. They'll claim the video of Brandon talking about supplements was taken out of context. They'll lean into their original plan, that Harrison is senile, grieving, and misinterpreting every scrap of information he finds." She walked over to me and placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Harrison, this isn't just a civil dispute anymore. This is a RICO case. We're talking conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and attempted murder. If we go to the police now, they might make bail. They might flee. Your assets would be tied up in court for a decade. So what do we do?" I asked, turning to face her. "We catch them in the act," Sarah said, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. "We need them to execute the crime. We need them to force you to sign that power of attorney while we're watching. We need to record them admitting to the poisoning in front of witnesses. We need a sting." I looked at Mike, then at David, and then at the folder on the table. The Phoenix Project. My wife had risen from the ashes to give me this chance. "They want me to sign tomorrow morning," I said. "At the house." "No," Sarah said. "The house is too controlled. We can't get a surveillance team in there without Justin noticing. We need a location you control. A place where we can set the stage." I thought about it for only a second. "The office," I said. "The old office downtown. The place where this all started." Sarah nodded. "Perfect. It's isolated at night. We can wire the entire suite for sound and video within an hour. I can have a team from the district attorney's office there in plainclothes. I still have friends in the major crimes unit. But you have to get them there, Harrison. You have to make them believe you're finally breaking." I pulled out the burner phone Mike had given me. My real phone was still in Justin's pocket back at the house. I knew Brandon's number by heart. I dialed it. It rang 4 times before a groggy, irritated voice answered. "Hello? Who is this?" "It's Dad," I said, making my voice sound thin, reedy, and full of a shaking terror. "Dad!" Brandon shouted, and I could hear him sitting up in bed. "Where the hell are you? Justin said you disappeared. He said you jumped out of a window. Are you out of your mind? We're calling the police." "Don't call the police," I pleaded, letting a sob catch in my throat. "Please, son." I was scared. I climbed down the scaffolding. I just needed to get away. I went to St. Mary's, to the church. "I needed to pray to your mother." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in Brandon's head as he calculated the situation. He was relieved I hadn't gone to a police station. "Okay, Dad," he said, his voice instantly softening into that fake, oily concern. "You're at the church. Just stay there. I'm coming to get you." "No," I said. "No, I'm done praying. I have clarity now. You were right, Brandon. I'm sick. I'm confused. I listened to that tape again and I realized I imagined things. I'm losing my grip." "That's good, Dad," Brandon said soothingly. "That's the first step to getting better. Admitting it." "I want to end this," I said. "I want to sign the papers. I want to go to Silver Lake. I'm just so tired of fighting. I want to be safe." "I'll bring the papers to the church right now," Brandon said, his voice eager and fast. "Not the church," I insisted. "It's too public. I don't want to do this in God's house. Meet me at the office in 2 hours. Eleanor's old office, where we found the safe. I want to sign the papers there where she worked. It feels right, like saying goodbye to her and the business at the same time." Brandon hesitated for a second. "Why the office, Dad? It's a construction zone." "Please, son," I begged, letting my voice crack. "Just give me this one last thing. Meet me there. Bring Justin. Bring Megan. Bring the lawyer. I want everyone there so there are no questions later. I want to sign it all over. The company, the house, the accounts. Everything. Just let me have this one piece of dignity." I could hear the greed finally override the caution in his brain. He saw the finish line. He saw the $12 million debt vanishing into my bank accounts. He saw the total control he had craved his entire life. "Okay, Dad," Brandon said. 2 hours. The old office. Don't go anywhere else. Don't talk to anyone. "I promise," I whispered. "I'll be waiting." I hung up the phone. The conference room was silent. Sarah was already texting her contacts at the DA's office, her face set in a hard mask of professional anticipation. David was packing his laptop, and Mike was checking the time on his watch. "You're a hell of a liar, Mr. Thorne," Mike said with a grim, respectful smile. "I learned from the best," I said, buttoning my coat and standing up. "My own sons taught me everything I know about betrayal." "Let's go," Sarah said, grabbing her briefcase. "We have a stage to set. And Harrison, when they walk into that room, I need you to be weak. I need you to be the victim right up until the moment the trap snaps shut." "Don't worry, Sarah," I said, walking toward the door with a cold, clear purpose. "I'll be the old man they think I am, right up until I bury them." I sat behind Eleanor's massive, scarred oak desk, the leather of the executive chair groaning softly as I shifted my weight. The office was a cavern of deep shadows, illuminated only by the cold, bluish streetlights filtering through the taped-up windows and a single low-wattage desk lamp that cast long, jagged silhouettes across the room. Every breath I took tasted like gypsum dust and old memories. I had positioned myself carefully, the light hitting only my face to hide the cold, hard resolve in my eyes. Behind me, the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall, the one we usually used for reviewing architectural blueprints, sat like a sleeping giant, its black surface waiting for my command. To my left, buried in the deepest shadows near the corner, stood a tall, dusty ficus plant. Behind its artificial leaves, Mike Kowalski waited, his massive frame perfectly still, holding his breath. To my right, concealed behind a stack of oversized drywall panels, two plainclothes detectives from the Major Crimes Unit were positioned, their presence signaled only by the faint, metallic click of their service weapons being checked. We were ready. I heard them before I saw them. First came the heavy, echoing thud of the fire door at the end of the hallway, followed by the sharp, rhythmic click-clack of Megan's high heels on the subflooring. Then came the voices, the confident, booming stride of men who truly believed they had already won the war. They were laughing. I heard the unmistakable, festive pop of a cork and the sudden, aggressive fizz of carbonation. They were drinking champagne. They were actually celebrating my legal funeral before my body was even cold. The door to the office swung open with a bang. Brandon led the way, looking like a man who had just been reborn. Gone was the desperate, sweating figure I'd seen on the side of the road. His suit was crisp, his hair was slicked back to perfection, and he carried a crystal flute of sparkling wine in one hand. Justin followed close behind, clutching the bottle like a trophy, his face already flushed from the alcohol and the sheer relief of their impending win. Megan was next, dressed in a somber, elegant black dress that suggested she was ready for a funeral, though her eyes were bright with a predatory greed. Bringing up the rear was Richard Sterling, the lawyer, clutching his leather briefcase like a weapon of mass destruction. "Dad," Brandon said, stepping into the center of the room. He scanned the dark corners, his eyes squinting as they adjusted to the gloom. "Why is it so dark in here? It's creepy." I kept my hands flat on the desk, letting my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my mouth to hang open just a fraction, playing the part of the broken, senile old man they desperately wanted to believe in. "It feels right," I said, my voice sounding reedy and raspy. "This is where it all started. With your mother. This is where it should end." Brandon walked over to the desk and set his champagne glass down on a coaster, looking at me with a sickening mixture of pity and contempt. "It's for the best, Dad. You know that, right? You're sick. You're confused. We're just doing what needs to be done to protect the Thorne legacy." He nodded to Sterling. The lawyer stepped forward with practiced, oily grace. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. The power of attorney, the conservatorship agreement, the total surrender of my life. He placed it on the desk in front of me, smoothing the paper with a manicured hand before laying a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen on top. "Sign right there, Harrison," Sterling said, his voice as smooth as engine oil. "Next to the yellow tab. Once you sign, we will take care of everything. The debts, the confusion, the stress. It all just goes away." I looked at the paper. I looked at the pen. My hand trembled, not because of age, but because of the sheer effort it took to keep from lunging across the desk. I reached for the pen, my fingers hovering over the signature line. Justin stepped forward, refilling Brandon's glass. "Cheers to new beginnings," he muttered, taking a direct swig from the champagne bottle. Megan moved to my side, her touch light and motherly. She reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out a thermos and a small paper cup. As she poured the clear liquid, I watched the water settle. "Here, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary sweetness. "You sound dry. Drink some water. It will help you focus." I looked at the cup. I knew what was in it. Sarah's team had intercepted the digital receipts for the arsenic, but my gut told me Megan wouldn't miss a chance to make sure I was compliant for the trip to the state facility in Gary. I took the cup, my hand shaking so violently that the poisoned water slushed over the rim and onto my knuckles. "Thank you, Megan," I whispered. You always take care of me." She smiled, and it was the cold, hollow smile of a shark. "Always. Now, Dad, drink up, and then sign." I brought the cup to my lips. I saw Brandon watching me with an intense, hungry gaze. He wanted me to drink. He wanted me sedated. He wanted the Thorn legacy in his pocket. I lowered the cup without taking a sip. "Wait," I said. Brandon let out a loud, exasperated sigh. "What now, Dad? Just sign the damn paper." "I need to know," I said, my eyes filling with genuine tears of grief for the family I had lost. "I need to know that you won't sell the house. That's where I lived with your mother." Brandon rolled his eyes, leaning down until his face was inches from mine. "Of course, Dad. We're keeping the house. We're keeping everything. We're going to preserve the legacy. Promise. Now sign." "Liar," I said. I dropped the gold pen. It hit the desk with a sharp, metallic clack that sounded like a gunshot. I slowly straightened my spine. I pulled my shoulders back, the senile slouch vanishing. I set my jaw and looked Brandon dead in the eye with a hard, cold clarity that made him recoil. "I don't think I will sign," I said, my voice ringing out strong and steady through the quiet office. The room went deadly silent. Brandon blinked, his mind struggling to process the sudden shift. "What did you say?" he whispered. "I said I'm not signing," I repeated. "And I'm not drinking your water, Megan." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the remote control. Brandon straightened up, his eyes darting to the remote. "What are you doing?" "I'm showing you the legacy you really built, son," I said. I pointed the remote at the wall behind me and pressed the power button. The large monitor flared to life, its brightness blinding in the dim room. The high-definition video feed from the iPad filled the screen, the audio booming through the office speakers. It was Brandon. He was standing in his marble kitchen, holding a drink. "No, we're not sending him to Silver Lake *" his recorded voice sneered, the cruelty echoing off the bare walls. "That place costs $10,000 a month. I'm not wasting our inheritance on luxury sheets for a vegetable. I found a place in Gary, State Run. It smells like bleach and boiled cabbage, but it's secure *" In the office, the real Brandon froze. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish stranded on a dock. Then the video cut to Megan. She was on the phone, her voice chillingly clear. He's getting worse *" she was saying. The soup worked. He was dizzy all afternoon. I'm going to up the dose tomorrow. Just a little more arsenic. Dr. Evans says if his kidneys fail, it will look like natural causes. We just need him to sign the papers first *" In the office, Megan let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. The paper cup of water slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor and exploding in a splash of poisoned liquid that soaked her expensive shoes and the hem of her dress. She stumbled back, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God!" she whispered. "Oh my God!" Justin dropped the champagne bottle. It shattered on the concrete, sending shards of glass and foam everywhere. Sterling, the lawyer, looked at the screen, then at me, and immediately began to back away toward the door, clutching his briefcase as if it could shield him. I stood up. I didn't need the desk for support anymore. I towered over them, fueled by a white-hot rage. "Bleach and boiled cabbage," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "That was your plan for the man who paid for your college, who bought your cars, who built this entire company." Brandon spun around, looking for the camera. "Where did you get that?" That's illegal. You bugged my house. Your mother bugged your house. I roared, slamming my hand onto the desk with a force that made the remaining glass jump. Eleanor knew what you were. She saw you coming a mile away. Brandon looked at me, his eyes wide and wild. He realized the walls were closing in, and the $12 million debt was about to crush him. He looked at the power of attorney on the desk, his last desperate way out. "Sign it!" he screamed, lunging across the desk at me. "Sign the paper, old man, or I will kill you myself." He reached for my throat, but he never made it. From the shadows behind the ficus plant, Mike Kowalski stepped out. He moved with the terrifying speed of a professional athlete. He caught Brandon by the back of his expensive suit jacket and yanked him backward with one hand. Brandon flew across the room, crashing into a stack of drywall panels. A cloud of white dust exploded into the air. Justin saw his brother fall, and panic finally took hold. He grabbed the nearest thing to him, a heavy brass lamp from a side table, and raised it over his head, charging at me with a guttural scream. "Police! Drop the weapon!" The shout came from behind the drywall. The two plainclothes detectives emerged, their service weapons drawn and leveled directly at Justin's chest. Justin froze, the lamp trembling in his hands. He looked at the guns, then at me, then at the fire exit. "Drop it now, or we will shoot," the lead detective barked. The lamp fell from Justin's hands, crashing to the floor. He raised his hands slowly, tears of terror streaming down his face. "Dad," he sobbed. "Dad, please. I didn't mean it. Brandon made me do it." Just then, the wail of sirens cut through the cold night air. Red and blue lights began to pulse against the taped-up windows, flashing like a heartbeat. Sarah had timed it perfectly. The cavalry had arrived. The door burst open, and uniformed officers poured in. Richard Sterling was the first to be handcuffed. He didn't fight. He just hung his head, knowing his career was over. Megan was next. She was screaming hysterically, kicking at the officers and claiming she was sick, pregnant, anything to save herself. Two officers hauled Brandon to his feet. He was bleeding from a small cut on his forehead where he'd hit the drywall, and he looked at me with a gaze of pure, concentrated hatred. "You're crazy," he spat as they clicked the cuffs onto his wrists. "You're senile. None of this will hold up in court. I'll have you declared incompetent. I'll take everything." I walked around the desk. I stood right in front of him, close enough to smell the expensive champagne on his breath. I looked deep into his eyes, searching for even a trace of the little boy I used to take fishing, the boy I used to carry on my shoulders. He was gone, consumed by his own greed. "I'm not crazy, Brandon," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And I didn't lose my mind. I just lost my faith in you. And tonight, I'm taking back my name." The officers dragged them away. I watched as my entire family was led out of the building in shackles. Justin looked back at me one last time, his face a mask of pathetic regret, but I turned away. It was far too late for regret. Sarah Jenkins walked into the room, stepping over the shattered glass and the spilled, poisoned water. She looked at the scene, the broken bottle, the dropped gold pen, the files on the desk. "It's done, Harrison," she said softly. "The FBI is downstairs. They have the Phoenix file and the forensic report. Your assets are frozen for now, but they are safe." I nodded, feeling a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with my age. "Did we get them all?" I asked. Sarah nodded. "The money laundering charges will stick. The attempted murder charges against Megan might be harder, but with that video we have a solid case. And Sterling? He'll flip on them to save his own license. It's over, Harrison." I looked at the empty office. The false wall was gone, exposing the safe. The secrets were finally out. The rot had been cut away. Mike Kowalski walked over and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You okay, Mr. Thorne?" I looked at him. This man who wasn't my blood, but who had stood by me when my own flesh and blood tried to destroy me. "I will be Mike," I said eventually. I picked up the gold fountain pen from the desk and tossed it into the trash can. "Let's go home," I said. "I have a funeral to plan. Not for my wife, but for the father I used to be." The gavel came down with a sound that was final, like a coffin lid slamming shut for the last time. It was a sharp, dry crack that echoed off the high marble ceilings of the federal courtroom, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath my feet. I sat in the very back row, my hands resting heavily on the silver handle of my cane, watching as the men I had raised, the boys I had once taught to build birdhouses in the garage, were led away in heavy iron shackles. The air in the courtroom smelled of lemon-scented floor wax and old, dusty law books, a sterile environment for a tragedy that was anything but clean. Brandon didn't look at me as the marshals guided him toward the side door. He kept his eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of the bright orange jumpsuit that had replaced his custom-tailored Italian suits. There was no pride left in him, no arrogance, just the hollow look of a man who had finally run out of lies to tell. 15 years. That was the sentence the judge handed down for money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The judge hadn't held back, either. He had looked Brandon right in the eye and called him a predator in a white collar. A man who had exploited the sacred trust of his own family and the entire financial system with equal disdain. In the federal system, there is no parole. My oldest son would be 60 years old before he ever tasted freedom again. Justin received 8 years. His lawyer had spent hours arguing for leniency, painting a picture of a younger brother who had been manipulated and coerced by his dominant older sibling. The judge had bought the argument to some degree, but as he pointed out, complicity is still a crime, and Justin had been more than willing to spend the money they had stolen. Just before Justin disappeared through the door, he turned back to look at me. He was crying, real, terrified tears this time, not the fake, manipulative ones he used to use when he was trying to squeeze an extra few $1,000s out of my bank account. It was the look of a man who realized, far too late, that loyalty to the wrong person is nothing more than a slow-motion suicide pact. Megan's trial was separate, and in many ways it was much uglier. Because it involved the attempted murder and the poisoning of a family member, the details that came out in open court were the stuff of nightmares. Sarah Jenkins and her team had been incredibly thorough. They didn't just rely on the iPad footage, they brought in experts who found chemical residue, arsenic, deep within the plumbing of my house and Eleanor's old office. They painted a picture of a woman who treated the act of murder like a tedious household chore, something to be checked off a list between yoga classes and lunch dates. She was charged with attempted aggravated assault and poisoning. Unlike the boys, Megan didn't go quietly. She screamed when the deputies took her away, hurling curses at me, at Brandon, and at a world she felt had betrayed her. She had lost everything: her freedom, her reputation, and her status. But the most significant loss was the human wreckage left in her wake. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, my life didn't suddenly become peaceful. Instead, it became a series of long, exhausting days spent in sterile conference rooms with Sarah and David, the forensic accountant. We began the grim task of performing an autopsy on the corpse of Thorne Construction. It was a painful, meticulous process. We traced every single dollar, every fake contract with shell companies like Blue Sky, and every penny stolen from the employee pension fund. The rot went so deep it was structural. To pay back the creditors, the cheated subcontractors, and the employees whose retirement savings had been siphoned away, I had to make the hardest professional decision of my life. I chose to dissolve the company entirely. I stood in the center of the equipment yard on a gray, drizzly Tuesday morning, watching as an auctioneer sold off the Thorn fleet piece by piece. It was a surreal, heartbreaking sight. I watched the yellow excavators, the heavy-duty cranes, and the white pickup trucks, each one bearing the logo I had designed with Eleanor 40 years ago, being driven away by strangers. I watched the tools of the trade, the hammers, the saws, the levels, and the transit kits, being sold off in bulk lots to the highest bidder. 40 years of my life, 40 years of sweat, calloused hands, and early mornings building the skyline of Chicago were dismantled in less than 6 hours. It felt like I was watching a limb being amputated, a part of my very soul being carted away on a flatbed trailer. But it was the only way to make things right. I used every cent of those proceeds to make the pension fund whole again. I paid every single subcontractor who had been stiffed by my son's greed. By the time the dust finally settled, the name Thorn Construction was gone. Now just a footnote in a long and complicated court filing. However, amidst the rubble, we managed to save the foundations. Sarah and David were able to prove in court that the mortgages my sons had taken out on my family home and the downtown office building were completely fraudulent. They had used forged signatures, and because of that, the banks were forced to release the liens. Even the loan sharks, the men from the Janus Capital Syndicate, backed off once they saw the amount of federal heat coming down on the Thorn family. They realized that trying to collect on a forged debt from a man who was now a key witness for the FBI was a losing proposition. Kept my home. I kept Eleanor's building. But as I sat in my quiet house that evening, looking at the empty rooms, I realized that saving the buildings was the easy part. The real work, the work of building something new from the ashes of a broken family, was only just beginning. I had the Phoenix file and I had the truth, but I also had a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I went to my study and looked at the spot on the wall where Eleanor's picture used to hang. I realized that for the first time in a year, I wasn't just surviving, I was breathing. The air was clear of the lies that had suffocated me. But I also knew that the next chapter of my life wouldn't be about construction or contracts. It would be about a 7-year-old boy named Christopher, a child who had been lost in the shuffle of his parents' greed and was now the only future I had left. The shadows in the room grew long as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline. I thought about the words Eleanor had recorded on that tape, about how the phoenix rises from the ashes. I had burned down the old life, the old company, and the old betrayals. Now, I had to see what would grow in the space they left behind. 6 months had passed since the final sentencing, and in Chicago, that means the world had undergone a total transformation. The brutal, bone-shaking winter that had served as the backdrop for my family's collapse had finally retreated, replaced by a spring that felt more vibrant and earned than any I could remember in my 73 years. I've always found that Chicago springs are a reward for surviving the winter. The city seems to exhale, the gray slush giving way to a green so bright it almost hurts your eyes. As I drove toward St. Mary's Cemetery on a Tuesday morning, the air coming through the open windows of my old pickup truck was soft and smelled of damp earth and blooming lilacs. I pulled up to the familiar gates and sat there for a moment, the engine idling with a steady, rhythmic thrum. My joints still ached, but it was a different kind of ache now, the kind that comes from movement and purpose, rather than the heavy, stagnant weight of a secret I didn't even know I was carrying. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up a thick, expandable folder. It was the original Phoenix file, the one Eleanor had hidden behind the wall. I had gone through every page of that file 100 times with Sarah and the federal investigators. It had been the map that led us through the labyrinth of my son's betrayals. But this morning it looked different. I had taken a large rubber stamp and some bright red ink, and across the front cover, in bold, undeniable letters, I had stamped the words, "Case closed." It was a simple gesture, perhaps even a bit dramatic for an old contractor, but I needed to see those words in ink. I needed to know that the investigation was over, the trials were finished, and the poison had been drained from the Thorn name. I walked up the gentle slope of the hill toward Eleanor's grave. The wind was gentle today, a soft breeze that ruffled the leaves of the nearby oak trees. Nothing like the biting, hateful gale that had whipped around us on the day of the memorial. I knelt down on the grass, my cane resting beside me, and placed the file folder directly onto the soft earth next to her headstone. "I did it, Eleanor," I whispered, my voice thick with a mixture of relief and a lingering, quiet sorrow. "I cleaned the house. It cost us almost everything we built. The company, the reputation, the fleet, but the foundation is solid again." I sat there for a long time, having a silent conversation with the woman who had saved me from beyond the grave. She had always been the smarter one, the one who saw the cracks in the walls long before the ceiling started to sag. She had known I would be too soft on the boys, too willing to believe their lies because I wanted so badly for them to be the men I had hoped they would be. She had given me the weapon I needed, the shield to protect myself, and the push to finally see the truth. As I sat there, I heard the sound of slow, respectful footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. I recognized the heavy, deliberate stride. Mike Kowalski was walking toward me, but he wasn't alone. Beside him, holding Mike's large, calloused hand with a small, cautious grip, was a boy with big, observant eyes and a mop of dark hair. Christopher, my grandson. Brandon and Megan's son was only 7 years old, but he had already learned a lesson no child should ever have to master: how to be invisible. In that house of greed and high-priced marble, Christopher had been treated like an accessory, something to be shown off at holiday parties, and then tucked away with nannies and boarding schools when he became inconvenient. He was a quiet child, the kind of boy who watched everything but said very little, as if he were constantly waiting for the floor to give way beneath him. When the state began looking for next of kin after the arrests, there was no question in my mind. I had lost my sons, but I wasn't going to lose the only part of them that was still worth saving. Christopher had been living with me for 4 months now, and while the progress was slow, I could see the light coming back into his eyes. "Grandpa Mike says we're going to catch a monster fish today," Christopher said, his voice small but filled with a tiny, precious spark of excitement. I stood up, using my cane to steady myself, and looked at Mike. The man had stayed by my side through every deposition, every auction, and every long night in Sarah's office. He had become the son I wished I had raised, a man of his word who understood that a person's value isn't measured by the car they drive, but by the integrity of the things they build. "Mike knows where the big ones hide, son," I said, putting my hand on Christopher's shoulder. "But you have to be patient. Fishing is like building a house. You can't rush the parts you can't see." Christopher nodded solemnly. "I can wait." We walked toward the lake, an odd trio. An old man who had lost his business, a contractor with hands like shovels, and a boy who was just learning what it felt like to be loved. As we walked, the conversation turned toward the future. I had been liquidating assets for months, but there was one thing I had refused to sell: the downtown office building where Eleanor's office was located. "I'm not selling the building, Mike," I said, watching a pair of mallards land on the water's edge. Mike raised an eyebrow, shifting the weight of the tackle box he was carrying. "I thought you were done with the business, Harrison. You said you were retired for real this time." "I am done with commercial contracting," I said, a new kind of energy beginning to stir in my chest. But Eleanor didn't just want a library. She wanted to protect the legacy. And I think I finally understand what that means. I want to turn that entire building into something useful. A trade school. The Eleanor Thorne Center for Trades. Mike stopped walking and looked at me, a slow, wide grin spreading across his face. A trade school? In the middle of downtown? Exactly, I said. We teach kids how to build things properly. How to wire a house, how to plumb a sink, how to frame a wall so it stays straight for 100 years. We give them skills they can actually own, skills that nobody can take away from them, no matter what the market does. I looked at Mike, seeing the wheels turning in his head. He had spent his life in the mud and the dust just like I had. He knew the value of a trade. I need a project manager, Mike, I said, poking him in the chest with my cane. Someone who knows the building. Someone who knows that you don't cut corners, no matter how much money is on the table. Mike laughed, a deep, hearty sound that seemed to chase away the last of the cemetery's gloom. I'm just a guy with a hammer, Harrison. I don't know anything about running a school. You're the man who stood between me and a thief, I said, my voice dropping into a serious, steady tone. You're the man who saved my life. You're the director, Mike. I'll just be the grumpy chairman of the board who signs the checks. Mike looked down at Christopher, then back at me. He nodded, his eyes shining with a sense of pride I hadn't seen since the day we opened that safe. I'd be honored, Harrison. We reached the water's edge, and I sat down on a folding stool Mike had brought along. I helped Christopher bait his hook, showing him how to tie the knot with the same patience I used to show the young apprentices on my job sites 40 years ago. The sun was beginning to set, casting a long golden light over the lake that turned the water into a sheet of liquid copper. It was peaceful, a word I hadn't associated with my life in a very long time. As Christopher watched his bobber with an intensity that only a 7-year-old can muster, I thought about Brandon and Justin. They were sitting in their concrete cells, probably still trying to find a way to blame someone else for their failures. They had wanted the gold without the work. They had wanted the harvest without ever planting the seeds. They had lost their way because they never understood that the only currency that truly matters isn't in a bank account in the Caymans. It's in the eyes of the people who trust you. I looked at Christopher. He was the most important structure I would ever build. I wasn't going to make the same mistakes with him that I had made with my sons. I was going to teach him that a man is defined by his word, not his wallet. I was going to teach him that loyalty is earned, not bought. I was going to break the cycle of greed that had nearly swallowed us whole. Suddenly, the bobber dipped sharply below the surface. Christopher gasped, his small hands tightening on the rod. Pull, son, I said gently, leaning forward with a smile. Pull. He reeled it in with everything he had, his face lighting up with a pure, unadulterated joy as a small silver fish broke the surface of the water. It wasn't a monster fish, and it certainly wasn't worth any money, but to Christopher, it was a triumph. He had worked for it, he had waited for it, and he had earned it. I took a deep breath of the fresh spring air and felt the last of the winter's weight lift from my shoulders. The deception was over. The lies were gone. I had lost 2 sons, and that was a tragedy that would haunt me until the day I joined Eleanor on that hill. But I had saved the soul of this family, and I had saved the future of the boy standing right here in the golden light. Let's go home, boys, I said, putting my arm around Christopher's shoulders as Mike packed up the gear. We have a lot of work to start tomorrow. And for the first time in a year, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, I knew that I would finally be able to sleep. The finality of a gavel striking a wooden block is a sound that stays with you forever. In the construction world, we're used to the sounds of progress. The roar of a diesel engine, the rhythmic thud of a pile driver, the sharp crack of a nail gun hitting a stud. But in that federal courtroom, The sound of the judge's gavel didn't mean something was being built. It meant a life was being finished. I sat there in the very back row, my hands wrapped tightly around the silver handle of my cane, and I felt the weight of 40 years of fatherhood settling into a single, heavy, and heartbreaking conclusion. Brandon and Justin were led away in shackles, the metallic clinking of the chains echoing off the marble walls. Brandon, who had always been so incredibly proud of his custom-tailored suits and expensive Italian silk ties, now wore a shapeless, bright orange jumpsuit that seemed to swallow him whole. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. 15 years in the federal system is a long, daunting time for a man who has never known a single day of true hardship or manual labor. Justin, on the other hand, looked back one last time as the marshals guided him through the heavy side door. His 8-year sentence had finally stripped away the mask of the cool, successful restaurateur he'd tried so desperately to play. He was just a scared, middle-aged man who had followed his brother into a dark alley with no exit. Megan's departure from the courtroom was entirely different. There was no quiet resignation or shamed silence in her. When the judge read the sentence for her role in the systematic poisoning of Eleanor and me, she screamed. She cursed the court, she cursed the investigators, and finally, she turned her venomous gaze and cursed me. It was a chilling, desperate sound, the voice of someone who had lost their grip on reality because they could no longer manipulate the people around them. It was a stark, final reminder of the woman Eleanor had tracked through those digital receipts. A predator who treated the slow, chemical destruction of her family as if it were a simple business expense to be managed. When the courtroom finally cleared and the suffocating silence returned to the halls of justice, I felt an immense, bone-deep tiredness. But I knew there was no time for rest yet. I had a debt to pay, not a legal one, but a moral one that reached back 40 years. I had spent my entire life building a name that stood for quality and integrity in the city of Chicago, and I wasn't going to let that name die in a pile of criminal evidence and broken trust. The months that followed the trials were some of the most difficult and grueling of my life. I spent my days in stuffy, windowless conference rooms with Sarah Jenkins and David, our forensic accountant, performing a slow, painful autopsy on what remained of Thorne Construction. We traced every single dollar that Brandon and Justin had siphoned away, every fake contract they had signed with shell companies like Redstone and Blue Sky, and every penny they had stolen from the employee pension fund. The rot was so deep and so structural that the only way to save the foundation was to pull down the entire building. I made the agonizing decision to dissolve the company. It was a gray, drizzly Tuesday morning when I stood in the center of our equipment yard for the final auction. It's one thing to see your own sons in handcuffs. It's another thing entirely to watch 40 years of your physical labor and sweat being sold off piece by piece to the highest bidder. I watched the white pickup trucks with the Thorne Construction logo, the one I had designed with Eleanor at our kitchen table, being driven away by total strangers. I watched the heavy excavators, the cranes, and the transit kits, machines I had maintained with my own calloused hands, being loaded onto flatbed trailers. I even watched the bulk lots of hand tools being sold, the hammers, the saws, and the levels that had belonged to my loyal crew for decades. It felt like I was watching my own history being dismantled in 6 short, brutal hours. But as the checks started coming in from the auction, I felt a different kind of relief. I used every single cent of that money to make the employee pension fund whole again. I paid off every subcontractor who had been stiffed by my son's fraudulent shell companies. I settled every legitimate debt the company owed. By the time the final signature was dried on the final document, Thorne Construction was officially gone. The company that had built half of the commercial strip malls in the county was now just a footnote in history. However, amidst the wreckage, we had saved the downtown office building. Sarah had successfully argued in court that the mortgages and liens Brandon had taken out were completely fraudulent because the signatures were forged, and the banks were eventually forced to walk away. That building was Eleanor's heart, the place where she had kept the books and protected our future, and I wasn't going to let it be sold to some developer who would turn it into luxury condos. Instead, I turned to Mike Kowalski. Mike had been the only one who stood by me when the people who shared my blood were trying to bury me. He was a man of his word, a true master builder who understood the value of a job done right. "I'm turning the whole building into a trade school," I told him one afternoon as we stood together in the middle of Eleanor's empty office. "The Eleanor Thorne Center for Trades. We're going to teach kids how to build, how to plumb, how to wire. We're going to give them a foundation that nobody can ever take away from them." Mike had looked at me with a slow, wide grin spreading across his face. "A trade school downtown? Harrison, you're going to be the most popular man in the city with the unions." "I don't care about popularity anymore, Mike," I said, feeling a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost. "I care about the legacy. I need a director. Someone who knows the difference between a good weld and a cheap one. I need you." Mike had accepted the position, of course. He became the director, and I was just the grumpy chairman of the board who made sure the bills were paid and the coffee in the break room was always hot. But the most important project of my final years wasn't a school or a building. It was Christopher. When Megan and Brandon were sentenced, the state looked for a permanent home for their 7-year-old son. I stepped forward immediately. Christopher was a quiet, observant boy, a child who had been raised in a house of expensive marble and glass, but had never truly known the warmth of a real home. He had spent his young life being invisible, tucked away with nannies and in boarding schools while his parents chased the next big score. He didn't know me at first. To him, I was just the crazy, mean old man his father used to complain about over dinner. But slowly, brick by brick, we started to build something. We went fishing just like I had done with his father 30 years ago. I showed him how to bait a hook, how to tie a proper fisherman's knot, and most importantly, how to be patient. "You have to be patient, son," I told him as we sat together on the edge of the lake. "The big ones don't come easy. You have to earn them." I watched him as he stared at the bobber on the water. He was a different kind of build than Brandon. He had Eleanor's observant, intelligent eyes and a kind of quiet integrity that I hadn't seen in my sons in a very long time. I realized then that while I had lost 2 sons to greed and betrayal, I had been given a second chance to get it right with their boy. I wasn't going to give him a silver spoon or an easy path. I wasn't going to bail him out of every mistake he made. I was going to teach him that a man is defined by his word and the quality of his work, not the balance in his bank account. I was going to teach him that loyalty is earned through action, and that a real family is built on respect and truth, not just shared blood. As the sun set over the lake, casting long golden shadows across the water, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The Phoenix Project was finally complete. I had burned down the rot that was destroying us, and from the ashes, something new and honest was finally beginning to grow. We're often taught from a young age that family comes first, no matter what they do to you. We're told that blood is thicker than water. But this journey taught me that shared blood isn't a license for betrayal or abuse. My sons had chosen a path of easy money and lost their souls, and to save the future, I had to be strong enough to cut ties with the past and its toxicity. Protecting Christopher from the greed of his parents was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was also the most necessary thing I have ever achieved. I had lost the business I spent 40 years building, but I had regained my dignity, and that's the only currency that truly matters when you're standing at the end of your life. I put my arm around Christopher's small shoulders as Mike started packing up the fishing gear into the back of the truck. "Let's go home, boys," I said, feeling a smile that reached my eyes. "We've got a lot of work to do tomorrow." And for the first time since Eleanor passed away, I knew that tonight I would finally be able to sleep without the weight of a single lie pressing down on my chest.